The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Iranian nuclear program, the North Korean bomb, and Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea. The world is ablaze, and military matters are once again at the forefront of international politics. Because Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine is causing a huge geopolitical earthquake, no one trusts the neighbor, who rarely says hello, who shouts more than usual, and is not particularly friendly. The nightmare unleashed by the Kremlin has reminded us all that the unimaginable is entirely possible. So given the situation, it pays to be cautious, don't you think? We're seeing it in Europe, where practically all countries are announcing record military investments for the coming years, from the smallest nations like Estonia to the largest, such as Germany. And this is a trend that we can also see particularly clearly in the Asia-Pacific region. Because I think it's fair to say that lately, China's relations with most of its neighbors are not exactly at their best. China is becoming a superpower, and Xi Jinping's government has started to become much more commanding on regional issues. But to what extent can its neighbors rely on a country like China? What can they do to avoid succumbing to the giant? Well, that's exactly what explains news stories like this one.
Asia's military spending up 2.8% in 2021, bucking 1.8% global drop. Growth slows in region, but expenditures resilient to economic squeeze.
And of course now, following the war in Ukraine, even Japan has heard the warning bell. And what does this mean? Well, just as is happening in Europe, most countries here are preparing their accounts to increase their military spending. And take note, because at this point, we have to take something very much into account. Yes, China has become the great regional power in Asia Pacific, but its influence is not as overwhelming as we might think at first glance. For example, the Chinese Navy is the largest and most powerful in the region, but it accounts for only about 30% of the area's naval tonnage. In other words, there is competition. And so, VisualPolitik fans, this time we are not going to talk to you about the big players from countries such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, or China itself. No. In this video, we want to focus on two new emerging military powers in the Asia Pacific. Two that may still be a long way from the first division, but whose situation in a few years could change radically. What exactly are these countries destined to become the next military powers in the region? And just how influential are they likely to become? Could they be the counterweights that will determine the future balance of power between China and the West? Well, let's get into it. Take a look at this map. What you are looking at is the South China Sea, with the main territorial claims of the countries around its shore. As you can see, it is a huge puzzle. The dispute over these waters is so crazy that up to 4 countries are claiming the same piece of the pie at exactly the same time. And the problem is that China seems less and less willing to deal with all this mess. After all, it is the largest and strongest country in the area, so why not impose its will? Why not take over all the territory it considers its own and control all the natural resources that these waters may hold? Well, do you know what? That's exactly what Xi Jinping seems to think. And that is precisely why the Chinese government is increasingly raising the tone and its demands on these territorial claims. Of course, China's neighbors aren't sitting idly by, and they've said to themselves, we'd better watch out. The People's Republic of China wants to take the lead. The problem is that its neighbors are not willing to go along with its criteria, because it is one thing for China to be the strongest country and another for it to become a dominant power. So while between 2003 and 2018, China increased its military budget by 621%, Vietnam increased theirs by 687%, and other countries such as Indonesia or Thailand, which increased theirs by 255% and 264% respectively, now want to step on the accelerator even more. Let's just say that in the face of China's military escalation, more and more countries in the area have come to the same conclusion. If we don't prepare ourselves, this could end up disastrous for us. An idea that the current Russian invasion of Ukraine has proven to be neither an exaggeration nor an unfounded fear.
China has fully militarized 3 islands in the South China Sea, US Admiral says. Vietnam builds military muscle to face China. US seen bolstering military links in Southeast Asia to counter China.
Did you imagine that Vietnam, for example, the new rising star, was increasing its military budget even faster than China itself? Doesn't all this deserve its own VisualPolitik video? Well, listen up.
History that won't be repeated?
Vietnam knows all too well what it means to face a foreign power. Throughout the 20th century, it faced France, United States, what can I say, and also China itself. So if there's one thing the Vietnamese are clear about, it's that they have to be prepared for any eventuality. Precisely for this reason, the Vietnamese government included military reinforcement as one of the fundamental axes of its famous 1986 Doi Moi policy to reform its economic system and gradually adopt a model of state capitalism similar to that of China. It included military reform among the objectives because up to that time, Vietnam's armed forces were more like a series of fragmented, ill-equipped, and poorly trained military groups with little correlation amongst themselves. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union put the brakes on this change. Vietnam was a very poor country, and the Soviet collapse only made things worse, so military modernization had to wait. Nevertheless, with the arrival of the new country and its opening up to the world, the Vietnamese economy began to undergo a huge revolution, to the point of becoming one of the fastest growing economies in the world. As early as 2006, the 10th National Congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam set the goal of turning the country into a full-fledged naval power, both economically and militarily. Vietnam has thus begun to equip itself with relatively modern weaponry, mainly from Russia. Although, among its inventories, we also find South Korean anti-submarine frigates, French helicopters, and Israeli drones, not to mention an increasing amount of US equipment. Because despite their history, relations between the United States and Vietnam have been growing closer in recent years. Yes, Vietnam is much poorer than China, and its military budget is still a fraction of that of its northern neighbor, but if there's one thing Ukraine has proven, it's that you don't need to be the strongest if you have certain capabilities, and above all, if you get good friends.
Japan, Vietnam signed defense transfer deal amid China worries. US VP Kamala Harris makes historic visit to Vietnam.
We all know that. The Vietnam War has already shown what a trap this country can be for a foreign power. So Hanoi's strategy is to increase the cost to China of trying to take over the Vietnamese islets in the South China Sea as much as possible. This explains, for example, its determination to make their submarine fleet, currently with 6 units in service, one of the strategic elements of its defense. It also explains why it has devoted considerable resources to reinforcing the defenses of the Spratly Archipelago, where it has rocket launchers and attack systems with sufficient range to attack Chinese-controlled islets and neutralize their airfields and radar systems. This is not only a political or territorial issue, but also, and perhaps above all, an economic one. You see, Vietnam is experiencing a huge economic boom, and more companies are seeing it as a possible alternative to China, or at least as a way of reducing their exposure to the Asian giant. So it's not unusual to come across news stories like this.
Samsung invests $920 million in Vietnam plant expansion. Apple supplier Foxconn to build $270 million plant in Vietnam amid US-China tensions. LG Display raises investment in Vietnam factory by $1.4 billion, local government. The Lego Group announces plans to build new factory in Vietnam to support long-term growth.
It is precisely for this reason that controlling and ensuring the safety and integrity of the waters through which Vietnam exports all these goods is fundamental for continuing to attract foreign direct investment. But, VisualPolitik fans, Vietnam is far from the only country that is starting to move.
Guns versus butter.
If there's one country in Southeast Asia that aspires to become a major player in the region, it's none other than Indonesia. The reasons? The same as we have already seen in the case of Vietnam, the threat from China, and the need to ensure control of the waters through which its growing exports to the rest of the world transit. The fact is that Jakarta seems to have had enough of the constant Chinese military incursions in its waters. This explains why they have wanted to put their foot down, at the very least, make some noise in the media.
Indonesia's $125 billion air naval splurge may mean 50 warships at sea in the next 2 years. Amidst incursions by China into Indonesia's extended economic zone, Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto is looking for major investment in military gear.
The news story is tricky because it is a long-term investment figure, but these kinds of announcements are a way of saying, hey, we are here, and over the next few years, we're going to take the military issue much more seriously than we have done so far. Until now, military matters, as in most of the countries in the area, had been secondary, and in fact, the Indonesian military hardware is not only old, very old, but also a large part of it is in a very bad state. For example, in July 2020, a 1970s landing ship purchased from East Germany sank on them. In 2021, they lost a 40-year-old submarine in torpedo practice, resulting in the death of 53 sailors. What's more, accidents with trainer and light attack aircraft are the order of the day. But now the idea is that all of this will change. Among the materials that could arrive in the coming years, we find equipment such as the French Rafale, latest versions of the US F-15, and the new South Korean KF-21 fighter, in whose development program Indonesia is participating. But above all, this country's military strategy has a priority the development of what is known as a green water navy, a term that refers to naval forces specialized in coastal defense, which, on one hand, would allow it to control the national territory. Don't forget that we are talking about a country that has more than 17,000 islands, and on the other, hinder any ambition that China might have over them. The idea is a bit like what we have seen in Ukraine. A much, much stronger power is going to think twice before daring to get into a hornet's nest like this. This is what is known as operational psychological deterrence, a strategy that involves creating a maritime defense that makes any enemy incursion have a sufficiently high cost so that the potential invader completely abandons his plans. In other words, the cost to benefit ratio does not pay off. But to better understand what is behind this objective, we can take a look, for example, at the Natuna Islands, 272 islands under Indonesian control that are nevertheless within the line of the new points claimed by China. These islands also come with a gift. It is estimated that their subsoil contains trillions of cubic meters of gas. In fact, the enormous amount of gas estimated to be in place could turn them into one of the largest gas fields in the world. And I repeat, they are claimed by China as their own. I'm sure you now have a better understanding of the Indonesian determination to develop this green water armada as rapidly as possible. The idea is to equip 274 ships, 10 air combat squadrons, and 12 new diesel submarines, among other equipment.
Indonesia looks to triple submarine fleet after Chinese incursions.
Of course, there is also a problem. Many experts point out that Chinese precision-guided missiles, along with other technological advances such as drones themselves, would allow Beijing to attack and mop up the area before penetrating Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. This is what is known as war from home. Be that as it may, Vietnam and Indonesia are two examples of emerging economies that are now beginning to take this issue seriously. And keep in mind that between the two countries, they will soon have more than 400 million inhabitants and an ever-increasing economic development. In other words, we are not talking about a small potential. Now, let's take a look at this other map. Remember what we were saying earlier about the tonnage of naval forces in the region? China is becoming a superpower, but it is a surrounded power that would struggle to achieve dominance. Look at the map. Look at South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Together, they would form a kind of security barrier capable of greatly limiting China's ambitions and would force China to pay attention to too many different fronts. That's why improving the capabilities of Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines can be so important geopolitically, especially when these countries are forging closer ties with the United States, South Korea, and Japan, as the case seems to be. The game is far from over. The war in Ukraine has spurred the desire of all these countries to improve their capabilities to avoid becoming a future Ukraine. Makes sense, doesn't it? But now, it's your turn. Which countries do you think will be the future military powers of the world? How far will China's power go? Will it become a dominant power in the Asia-Pacific region? How far will this military race go? Leave us your impressions below in the comments. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Thank you very, very much once again for being here. All the best. I'll see you next time.